All right, I'm recording.
Who served for 20 years in the military and saw 2 different tours in Vietnam, and you remember Dr. Smither from the assembly who will be conducting the interview. With that, settle in.
Today's interview is being held at Kent City High School in Kent City, Michigan. The interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. And we're talking today with Mr. Fred Chambers of Belmont, Michigan. Now, Mr. Chambers, can you begin by giving us some background on yourself, to start with where and when were you born?
Okay, I was born in Orlando, Florida in 1940.
Right. What kind of work did your family do for a living in those days?
Well, during that time period, my family was common labor. My mother, she did housework. And it was really, I came from a really poor family.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what kind of education did you have?
I graduated from high school.
Okay.
I graduated from Jones High School in June the 6th, 1959.
All right. Now, at this point, you're in the South, and in those days, the South was still segregated.
Yes.
Did you go to an all-black high school?
All black.
And what kind of facilities did they have there? What kind of school was it?
Well, it was a fairly new school, because when I was in the 7th grade, the new high school was built, and I was the second class to go into the new high school.
Okay.
And during our high school, we went from 7th grade to 12th grade.
Right. And what proportion of the kids do you think actually finished high school there?
Very few. Very few.
So why did you finish?
I finished high school because I wanted to. It was, things was rough during my childhood, but I wanted to graduate from high school. So, rags to riches, I went to school.
Okay.
I graduated.
Right. Now, how many brothers and sisters did you have?
Okay, I have 2 brothers and 3. I had 2 brothers and 3 sisters.
And were they older than you or younger?
Well, I have 1 brother younger than I.
And did you get support from your family? Did your mother and your siblings kind of encourage you to stay in school, or?
No.
Okay. So you're just kind of on your own.
Yeah, I was on my own.
Okay. Now, did you do sports, or were you involved in things?
Yeah, I played all the sports. I played football, basketball, ran track, and actually I was pretty good in football, because I had a scholarship to go to college when I graduated from high school. But at that time, I knew that it would take more than a scholarship for me to complete my education, so I went into the service.
All right. Tell me a little bit about that decision to join the service. I mean, how did you come up with that idea?
Well, during that time period, down south, there was nothing for us to do. Okay, if you went to college, during that time period, most of the kids ended up being teachers. And at that time, I knew I couldn't go to college. Okay, so a friend of mine, he went in the Navy, so I decided, well, I'll go try the Army.
All right.
And that's how I ended up.
Okay. Now, describe the process here. You go to a recruiting office, and then what happens?
No, what I did, okay, I didn't want a 3-year enlistment at the time, so I volunteered for the draft.
Okay.
Okay, and of course, I got my greetings letter, and they sent me to Jacksonville, Florida for my field school and tested.
Okay. You said you volunteered for the draft. Normally, one thinks of either Uncle Sam just sends you a letter and says your number has come up, or alternatively, you go and you enlist. But was there some stage in the middle there?
No, see, actually, although we did have the draft, okay, but also you can, if you wanted a 2-year enlistment, you can volunteer for the draft instead of a 3-year enlistment.
Okay, so then if Uncle Sam does want you, then you're in for 2 years at that
Yes.
point. Okay. Now, where did they send you for basic training?
Well, they sent me for basic training. I went to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. I spent 8 weeks at Fort Jackson for basic training. Then, after completion of that, they gave me a 2-week leave, and I went home. And then I came back to Fort Jackson for my advanced infantry training.
Okay. Well, describe the basic training process itself. What was it like at that time?
Basic was rough, it was my first time being away from home, and it was really different. It's shocking, but it was rough.
Well, how did they treat you, or what surprised you about it?
Well, during that time period, the drill sergeants didn't treat you the way they do today. Okay, you know, that they get in your face. They didn't physically do anything to us, but they ride you, you know, they stay on your face, and the reason that they did it, you know, later on I realized the reason that they did it is because they want you to learn. Because if they didn't get on you, you won't learn.
And how quickly did you adapt to that?
It took me a while to adapt to that. I used to have nightmares at night. I didn't cry, but I had nightmares at night. And I never forgot one night in basic training, and you know, we were living in old World War II barracks. And I was upstairs. I was sleeping upstairs. And all of a sudden I woke up and I was down the street in front of the order room at the base. I didn't know how I got there. Scared me to death. So I got out of my bed, I climbed down the fire escape and walked down the street. Strange thing.
All right. Now, what kind of men were you training alongside? Where were they from? What kind of background they have?
But they we was integrated,
Mm-hmm.
and they were all over the country.
Okay. So it's a different kind of social experience in a way.
Well, during that time period, it was doing segregation in the South, and you know, I didn't run into too many problems as far as associating with the other soldiers.
Right. Because the Army had been integrated since 1948 or so.
Right.
So within the Army, they'd kind of gotten used to the idea. So they're moving in that direction. Now, you said you did your advanced training also at Fort Jackson. Okay. Now, what did that consist of?
Okay, infantry training. Okay, firing weapons, attacking hills. Okay, throwing grenades. You know, it's advanced infantry was the training for combat. The combat portion of the training that I went through.
Okay. Now, what kinds of people were training you at that stage, or did they have experience themselves?
A lot of them was Korean War veterans.
Okay. And did any of them talk much about those experiences?
No, they didn't.
Okay.
No, they didn't.
So you're just kind of learning your business at that
Yes.
point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then how long does that phase last?
Okay, basic advanced infantry was 8 weeks long, and then they had some recruiters come out. They would, you know, dress nice, they shine boots, starch fatigue. They looked good, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, "Well, who would like to go airborne?" At the time, I really didn't know what airborne was all about, so I raised my hand.
Mm-hmm.
So after I finished my advanced infantry, next thing I knew, they put me on a bus and sent me to Fort Bragg, North Carolina for jump school.
Okay. Now, what did that consist of?
Oh, it was miserable. It was rough. We started out with 1,200 students. Only 620 of us graduated.
Mm-hmm.
Because during that period, you can, if you didn't think you had it in, then you can drop out at any time.
Now, what are the steps for actually training you to jump out of an airplane?
Well, mostly it was physical training. Okay, and then of course they had the, like I said, physical training. We always ran. Everywhere we went, we ran.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, like idiots running around. Every time our left foot hit the ground, we say airborne, 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 all over the place, you know. And they taught us how to do parachute landing. They taught us how to stand in the door. They had mock towers, where you stand in the door and jump out the tower. But you got risers on on a cable where you jerk and then you just roll down the cable.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then how far into it do they have you actually do a real jump?
Okay, 6 weeks. Jump school is 6 weeks. Okay, at the end of 6 weeks, okay, you go up for your first jump. And first, this is the first time I ever flew in an airplane. Okay, so we went up that morning, and they opened the door in the plane. The plane actually sounded louder than it actually were. And we jumped. And I came down like a feather. I was unbelievable. I hit the ground. Oh man, this was a piece of cake.
Mm-hmm.
So that day, that afternoon, we went up and jumped again. I hit the ground like a ton of bricks.
So what was the difference?
I think the wind.
Mm-hmm.
The wind was the difference.
Okay. Now, how many jumps did they have you do?
In jump school, you have to jump 5. You have to have 5 jumps
Mm-hmm.
before you get your wings.
Okay. Now, did very many guys get hurt doing the jumps, or was it fairly safe?
Well, the purpose of jump school was so hard until when it came to jump, you did everything automatically.
Mhm.
And I would wager right now, if I went up and jumped, I'd jump the same way I did many years ago.
Okay. So you know how to land and what to
How
do
to
with your
land, yeah.
legs and everything like that?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay. Now, what did you do then after you finished with the jump school?
Well, I was assigned to an infantry unit, and all we did mostly is train.
Okay.
We jump and train. Well, we go out on maneuvers. We jump in the drop zones, and then we have war games.
All right. And what unit were you serving with then at that point?
I was with the 187 Infantry at Fort Bragg.
Mhm. And is that part of a particular division or just?
It's 82nd Airborne
Right.
Division.
Okay. Then, how long does that last before you get moved someplace else?
So okay, what happened is at the end of my 2 years, when come time to re-enlist, okay, my first sergeant told me if I didn't want to be in the infantry for the rest of my life, to volunteer to re-enlist for another school.
Mm-hmm.
So I re-enlisted for ammunition records. Okay, and then they sent me to Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland for training. Then after my training, they sent me right back to Fort Bragg to the 407 supply company.
Okay. And what did the actual training consist of at Aberdeen?
Aberdeen was all administrative, maintaining records
Mhm.
on ammunition.
So you're basically going to school?
It's a school.
Okay. Learn how to do that kind of work.
Mhm.
All right. Now, so at this point, are you thinking you might well just stay in the military for a career?
Yeah, after my first 2 years was up, okay, I got to thinking, if I go back home, what am I going to do? There's nothing back there for me.
Mhm.
So I decided to re-enlist, and 25 years later, I retired.
Right. Okay. So then once you get your training, then do you go back to Fort Bragg?
I went back to Fort Bragg, and I was assigned to a supply company, ammunition section in the 82nd Airborne Division.
Okay. And what rank were you at that point?
I was a Spec 4, E4.
Okay. And then, I don't know, what was life like then in that period? This is sort of 1962, 3. What was your daily life like?
Well, most of it we did in the service was just train. We trained, and when I was in supply, ammunition supply, okay, what we did, we maintained the basic load of ammunition for the division, and we used to add it, register everything in the airborne unit. You're able to drop it
Mhm.
out of the plane.
Right.
And we just have to maintain the basic load, rotate them, keep them ready to go. Cause we was able to move at a moment's notice. We can go anywhere in the world.
Okay. Now, did they have you go on maneuvers or move you different parts of the country or do things like that, or were you just going to stay in Fort Bragg?
Well, we go down in the summertime. We used to go down in South Carolina, the cities. They have war games
Mhm.
within the city, and also we would fly from Fort Bragg. We would fly down to Fort Benning, Georgia, and have a parachute jump, and then have war games down there.
Okay. Now, this is still early 60s, and you don't get things like civil rights acts and formal desegregation until just a little bit later. But you're in the integrated Army, you've got some training and some experience, and you're part of a unit. What was it like to go kind of off base at that time?
Basically, down there in the military, mostly the GIs are all one color. Okay, and even in the South, I never had any hassle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because during that period, is whenever you travel to and from leaving and home and anything, you had to wear a uniform.
Right.
And people wasn't messing with the government.
Okay. So you could sit where you
I
wanted
sit
to?
where I want. I could sit on the front of the bus. No one said anything.
Mm-hmm.
If someone didn't want to sit next to me, I let them stand up. You know?
Were you paying much attention to things like what was going on with the civil rights movement and so forth at that time? Because it is making the news by then.
When the civil rights really got popular, I wasn't here in the United States.
Mhm.
I was stationed in Okinawa.
Because it builds up over a course of time from the 50s onwards, but yes, most stuff really out in the streets is kind of more mid-60s and so forth. So you're basically at Fort Bragg then until the beginning of 1964.
Yes, in 1964, okay, I left Fort Bragg and went to Okinawa, my first overseas tour.
Now, were you going with a unit or were you being
I went in
assigned?
the unit, okay, the year prior, Okay, the unit already went over and established, it was the 173rd Airborne Brigade,
Mm-hmm.
and I went over as a replacement.
Okay, so you're joining an existing unit that's already been in place then
Yes.
for a while. What kind of reception did you get when you got there?
Well, like I say, you know, in the military, you know, race has nothing to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
And wherever you go, you always, the thing about the military, everywhere you go, you meet people. You meet somebody different everywhere you go.
Right.
So you might see them for 2 years, then you leave, you meet somebody else.
Now, were they kind of welcoming or helping you get acclimated and showing you what to do, or?
No, basically because I was already trained.
Mm-hmm.
And then once I got there, I was assigned to a unit doing what I was trained to do.
Okay, so you had a job, you were familiar with all the
Yes,
procedures, you could
yes.
just go do that. Okay, now, what was the base itself in Okinawa like? How would you describe that?
Okinawa is an island about 13 miles wide at the nearest point, at the widest point, 3 miles wide at the nearest point. And all it is a core rock. The surprise that I got when I first went overseas is that I'm going to Okinawa, you know, island.
Yeah.
You know, white sandy beaches,
Mhm.
palm trees. That wasn't Okinawa. No, that wasn't Okinawa. Okinawa was like a core rock, you know.
Right. Now, did you have much contact with the civilian population there, or did you stay on the base? Or
No,
not?
we went. We was allowed to leave the base. And we're associated with the Okinawa, which is the Ryukyus,
Mhm.
doing the first tour. So I had 2 tours on Okinawa. Now my second tour on Okinawa, I ran the ammunition depot there, and they had Okinawans working for me.
Mhm.
Civilian Okinawans working for me.
What kind of relationship was there between the Okinawan population and the American servicemen at that time?
Well, personally with me, is that I like to associate with whatever country I go to. I like to associate with the locals. Some Americans, it didn't happen that way, but I always like to associate with them, their lifestyle, their customs, and I respected their customs, and I got along well with them.
Okay. So how would you go about learning something about them? You just go into town, go into a restaurant or a bar? Or what
No,
do you do?
those most was the ones that were working for me.
Okay.
When you go downtown to the bar, the restaurant, that was different.
Mm-hmm. But you had people on the base that you could meet and talk to and get to know a little bit?
Yes. Mhm.
Right. And did any of them ever do anything like invite you to their home?
Well,
or?
well, they invite. Thing about it too, like when an Okinawan man invites you to a party, okay, there's nothing but men,
Mm-hmm.
and of course we sit along the table and pass the bottle around.
Right.
Okay, and when the women invite you to a party, there's nothing but women. They don't party together like we do.
But would they invite American servicemen to parties?
They would invite. Okay, the girls that invited me was the ones that worked
Okay.
for me,
Okay.
and the guys that worked for me,
All right.
they invited me into their homes.
Okay. Now, how long did that stint on Okinawa last?
Okinawa, let's see, I was on Okinawa for about maybe 13 months before, like I said, Airborne unit,
Mm-hmm.
and we considered a strike unit.
Right.
Okay, so they called us on alert. We stayed on alert for 3 weeks. Next thing I know, I was on a plane head for Vietnam.
Okay. And do you remember about when that was?
May, as a matter of fact, I landed in Vietnam on May the 5th, 1965.
Okay. So this is right at the
beginning.
You're about the very first regular American unit
Right,
in then.
right. We were the first Army combat unit to get into Vietnam, to come into Vietnam
Okay.
from Okinawa.
So you got in there ahead of Mel Gibson then?
Yes,
So
yes, we did.
We have a movie about the
Yes, we
cavalry
did.
going in, but
No,
the
no,
Airborne
no,
was
no,
in
no,
first.
The 173rd Airborne Brigade separate,
Mhm.
the first combat unit into Vietnam.
Okay. Now, where did they send you first in Vietnam?
Okay, what happened is half of the brigade went to Vung Tau, and the half that I was with went to Benoit. Our primary mission was to defend Benoit Air Force Base.
Okay. And what was there when you got there?
Well, of course, the Air Force was already there,
Mm-hmm.
and that was it. We were set up on the other side of the runway in pup tents, eating dirt, you know. It was rough.
What was your first impression of Vietnam when you got there?
Well, the thing that got me about Vietnam is when we landed, the first thing they told us don't shoot at anybody unless they shoot at you first.
Mhm.
And if you fire your weapon in Vietnam, you was in trouble. And of course, you know, personally, you don't fight wars that way, but that's the way it was during the early stages of Vietnam.
All right. And what was the general situation or the climate at the time? You show up, you're now there at an air base. Were you there to guard it against attack, or were you
Right.
going?
We were there to guard against attack. Plus our combat units were going out on missions and on patrols.
But with the nature of your job, you pretty much would stay on the base.
Well, I stayed on the base, and also we used to transport ammunition from Saigon to Benoit. And also I had a demolition squad where when the infantry ran into things that need blowing up, okay, we would go out and blow it up for them.
Okay. Well, what kind of things would you blow up?
You know, weapons,
Okay.
rice caches, you know, munitions.
Okay. At this point, were you finding things like tunnels or fortifications or that sort of stuff?
Oh yeah. There was tunnels. Even when we got to Vietnam, there was tunnels all over the place,
Mm-hmm.
and that was their mode of transportation. And they were very intelligent.
Did you have any problem with people infiltrating onto the base?
Well, the problem that you had is all military bases, okay, they hired local nationals to work for them. And the local nationals can work for you today, and they can be shooting at you at night, because you never know who is who. You know, because they all look the same, so you know, you never know who you're really fighting.
What understanding did you have of why you were in Vietnam or what you were trying to accomplish?
Okay, like I say, I was in the military. The government sent me there. Okay, and they sent me there because the South Vietnamese wanted to be free, and the North was communist. They wanted to turn them into a communist country. So we went there to help them keep their freedom.
Okay. And did you have the impression that the South Vietnamese that you saw wanted you to be there, or could you not tell?
Well, you know, some wanted us to be there. You know, but we hurt the economy by being there
How did that happen?
because of our income at the time. Our monthly income was more than they were making the whole year,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, we spending the money.
And so that prevents, why would that hurt the economy if you're spending money?
Because they couldn't afford, things got high and they couldn't afford the things that they used to be able to afford.
Okay. So prices would go up because you could pay them
Right,
and the locals couldn't.
right.
All right. Now, how long did you spend that base there?
Okay, my first tour, I spent a year there. And then they sent me back, I left Vietnam, they sent me back to Redstone Arsenal, Alabama as an ammunition instructor.
Okay. Now, during the course of that year there, when you're on that air base, did the climate there change at all, or the feeling about what was going on in the war change at all, or did it seem pretty much the same day to day?
It was the same day to day.
Okay. And did you have any sense of whether you were winning or losing the war, or?
You know, at that particular time, I didn't agree with the way we were fighting it, based on the fact that that's just like you and I can come in your yard and fight you, and then I go back in my yard and you can't do nothing about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way the war was. They can attack us, okay, then they go back across the border, and
Right.
nothing that we can do.
Right. Okay. So you get through a year of that. Were you relieved to be sent back home, or you just said, okay, it's the next thing? Or?
No, yeah, I was glad to get back to see my family because it had been 18 months or more since I've seen them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they sent me back to, and what they did, they sent me back to Redstone Arsenal because the job that I had, and they sent me back there as an instructor. And I instructed there for about 18 months, and they sent me back to Okinawa. And I went back to Okinawa in '67 as a ammunition chief clerk.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Was the second experience much different from the first one?
Yes, it was based on Okinawa. It was based on the fact that I had the local nationals working for me, and I got a chance to communicate with the people,
Mm-hmm.
the Okinawan people.
Okay, so the first time you hadn't gotten to do as much
No,
of that.
because there wasn't that much contact between my first tour. There was not the unit that I was in. there wasn't much contact between the local nationals and the GIs.
Okay. Now, were you a higher rank too? Did you have more
I was-
responsibility?
Okay, I was at that time I was staff sergeant, which is E6.
Mm-hmm. So, you,
And of course, and I made E7 while I was stationed in Okinawa.
okay. So you got a little more authority. You got more people working for
Right.
you, and that kind of thing. What kind of living accommodations did you have there?
We had we lived in barracks, okay, and with the NCOs, we had our own private barracks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and of course, the enlisted men, they had barracks separate from us where they lived.
Right.
And they were brick buildings, they were modern buildings.
And then while you're there, are you wondering about whether or not they're going to send you over to Vietnam?
Well, I had already been to Vietnam once. So because I've been to Vietnam once, I had no idea. I didn't think about going back to Vietnam again. Okay, and when I left Okinawa, okay, after my 18-month tour there, they sent me to Redstone House in Alabama. No, they sent me to Fort Bragg, Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. I was the first sergeant of an ammunition company there. Okay, 18 months in, I get orders saying I was to report to McGuire Air Force Base. Okay, I was going back to Okinawa.
Mm-hmm.
I was going back to Vietnam.
Yeah.
And I said, no, I know I'm not going back. Because normally during that time period, when you go to McGuire, you're going to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I said they made a mistake. But they sent them to McGuire. They flew me from McGuire to Washington, Seattle, Washington, and off to Vietnam for the second tour.
When they fly you to Vietnam, how do they send you?
Commercial airline.
Okay. And then, so you're riding with a bunch of civilians?
No. All GIs.
Okay. So they charter the airline essentially?
Right. See, during the Vietnam War, the government contracted civilian airliners to take us to and from Vietnam.
Okay. Now, some of the stories that you get from Vietnam, let's talk about, you get off these commercial jets and the stewardesses are wearing flak jackets on the runway and things like that?
No.
I didn't see any of that.
No.
Okay. Well, what assignment did you have when they sent you back to Vietnam?
Okay, they sent me back when the second assignment that they sent me there, I was assigned to USAV, United States Army Vietnam, and I was assigned as an ammunition inspector with the adjutant general. And what I would do, I would go around to the different units throughout. I would fly throughout Vietnam and inspect the way they keeping their munition, make sure they're keeping their munition safe and clean.
Okay. And they, who were the they?
The troops.
The Vietnamese troops?
No,
or the
our
Americans?
troops.
Okay.
My first was our troops.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then they did away with my position there in the IG, and I transferred to headquarters MACV in Saigon, and I was assigned to the Vietnamese Ordnance Corps,
Okay, so the MACV, it's military.
Military Assistant Command Vietnam.
Right. So basically, the Americans were assigned to work as advisors with the
With the
Vietnamese.
Vietnamese, right? I was assigned to a Vietnamese unit
Mhm.
as an advisor.
Okay. Were the Vietnamese units run differently from the American ones?
Yes, they're more laid back than the American units.
All right. Did you think they were as ready to fight or likely to be as effective as the Americans, or what impression did you have of them just as a military force?
Well, it's hard to say. It's hard to say.
Okay. Because you weren't seeing them actually in action.
No, I wasn't in action with them. No.
Okay. One of the things that comes up sometimes when you talk about supply and ordnance and all of this kind of stuff are issues of corruption or black market or things disappearing or any stuff like that. As far as you can tell, was there any trouble keeping track of material or things?
Oh yeah, there was lots of black market going on. As a matter of fact, during that time period, I smoked the Winston 100s. The only way I can get them is on the black market. And I know they came in on the ships, but I couldn't get them at the PX, the military stores.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And was there a lot of kind of trading of just in American goods and things, that stuff that was brought in for the military that people just...
It just disappeared from the docks.
Mm-hmm.
It comes in and it disappears.
Now, was the general climate or atmosphere in Vietnam at the time you were there, that second time, which is 70 through much of 71, was that different now than it had been back in 65, 66? Did you see anything that was different, or did things seem to be different at all?
No, not really. No.
Okay. this was a period when the Americans were starting to draw down their military presence there.
Not really.
Not too much.
Not,
from what you saw.
we weren't drawing down, doing my second tour.
Mhm.
We hadn't began to start drawing down.
Okay. But I guess in the military records that were by the end of 1971, then there are fewer Americans there.
In 71, right.
Yeah.
At the
Right.
end, I was already,
Right.
out of there.
Okay.
And what happened is that at the end of my last tour, well, my last tour as an advisor also was that we would fly out throughout the country and check the Vietnamese, make sure that they're not only Vietnam, also in Cambodia too, where everyone's supposed to be.
Now, were there Vietnamese in Cambodia, or these Americans, or?
Well, the Vietnamese, the Cambodian troops, and we did have American troops there too.
Okay. And did you get any sense of how ready they were to deal with new attacks or things like that?
Well, to me, the people was easily influenced. Now, if I go back to 65 when I went over, 65 when I went over, a lot of people thought the Vietnamese thought they were still fighting the French.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't know that they was fighting the Americans. That's how naive they were.
Okay. Now, were there places that you went where it was relatively unusual for them to see a black soldier?
Oh yes. Okay, when I was advisor of the Vietnamese Ordnance Corps, okay, we would fly out. The plane would come in, pick us up in Phnom Penh, and we'd fly out to the different villages. And when the plane land, the whole village, I get off the plane, the whole village would gather, to see me.
Mm-hmm.
They want to touch me.
Mm-hmm.
At first, I understood that they never seen anybody as dark as me before,
Right.
but, it was weird, but it happened.
Because that was mostly in Cambodia, and that was a place.
Cambodia.
Well, they wouldn't have seen that many Americans to begin with. In
Exactly.
Vietnam, it would have been a lot more common.
Right.
Okay. Now, eventually they rotate you back out of there again. Was it time for you to leave? As far
Right.
as
That's
you were
what happened is my last tour in Vietnam, the Army brought my younger brother over.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and what I did, I extended 6 months of my tour in order for them to ship him back to get him out of the country. So they shipped him back to Okinawa, and I stayed.
Now, how would that work? Do you just fill out some paperwork?
Right.
or-
Mm-hmm. You would go in, especially when you got two brothers. Okay, my oldest brother was blind, and my younger brother, he was the only surviving male in the family. So what I did was fill out an extension, okay, and then they rotated him out.
So there were policies in place that would guarantee a family wouldn't lose all of their boys in the same place.
Exactly.
Okay. And that probably goes back all the way to World War
To
II.
World War
to some
II, yes.
extent.
That's when, I forgot that these are this Navy.
Sullivans,
The
yeah.
Sullivans. Yeah, what happened to the Sullivans.
Okay. But you knew the system well enough to know that if you stayed, that your brother gets to go
Yes.
back.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then.
And what happened is, when you get a dream sheet where you would like to be stationed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we had recruiters come over and from USAREC and recruit recruiters.
Mm-hmm.
They need recruiters. So I volunteered for recruiting duty. Okay, never got an answer back. When time for me to rotate, I had orders sent me to Fort Lee, Virginia. Okay, and so when I started processing out, I said I already sent all my baggage to Fort Lee. So when I started processing out, I had orders sending me to recruiting school.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they were sending me to TDY, which is temporary duty, at Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indiana, with duty Detroit Recruiting Main Station,
Okay.
with duty Grand Rapids.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, I didn't even know where Grand Rapids was, and that was in January. They sent me up here.
Okay.
And after spending 18 months in Vietnam, where it's hot, you can imagine what it was like when I got to Grand Rapids.
All right. Now, you're becoming an Army recruiter here, middle of 1972. That's pretty close to around the time when they end draft and and so
Yes.
forth. And had it ended by the time you started, or was it still the very last stages?
It was the last stages of the draft.
Okay.
Because at that time period, we had college students got deferments to go to college,
Mm-hmm.
and they ended the draft, and they still had to make the commitment.
Okay. So you had to do kind of stragglers or people
Yeah.
who would have gone earlier, and now they come in.
Mhm.
Now, you're also coming in as a recruiter by this time in 1972. The Vietnam War has had a lot of media attention. It's a pretty unpopular war. There have been a lot of protests and things, and you know, President Nixon's working on trying to find a way out of it and this kind of stuff. Was it hard being a recruiter in that climate?
You know, really not really, because a lot of things people don't realize is that Vietnam was an enlistment option. We had people enlisting into the Army to go to Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
and a signed contract, which means that when the war ended, the Army violated their contract, so they had to let them out. Either you choose to go somewhere else, or you can get out.
Okay. And if you get let out, do you still get all of the GI benefits?
No.
Okay.
No.
But you actually had people who signed up and wanted to be sent
Oh
there?
yeah, oh yeah. It was an enlistment option.
Okay. And what motivation would people have for wanting to go?
I think it's something, most people have been fighting all their life, and there's something in our genes
Mm-hmm.
for a soldier, Because lots of guys love to go to combat. And that just, that's just the way it was,
So you had people who actually wanted to get into
And,
combat,
yes. Mm-hmm.
and they thought that would be where they would go.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What did you say to people who came in and they were interested?
Well, one thing about it, I was successful in recruiting. I spent 13 years in recruiting prior to my retirement. But I was always honest with people, upfront with people, telling them exactly. Sometimes I made things seem harder than it actually were. And then when they come back, they say, "Oh, it wasn't as hard as you said it was." But it's their choice. I never had to force anybody, to go into anything.
Okay. Now, as you're in this job for some time, so you go a couple of years into this, you get to 74, 75, the Americans are kind of out of Vietnam, you've got an all-volunteer army. Did that change things? Was it getting harder to find good quality people?
Right. We had quotas to make, and it was hard. It was hard to get people to go in. And lots of people go in, they went in for the education benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. Plus, we had lots of low-income people going into the service.
Mm-hmm. Were there problems finding people to fill the skill positions or things where they needed some more education?
Yes, there were. The Army during that time period wasn't as technical as it is today.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember times when recruitment qualification was so low to you can pronounce your name, you can go in.
Mm-hmm.
That's how bad things were.
And were they very concerned about sort of physical conditions or?
Oh yeah, you have to be physical. You have to pass the physical in order to go in.
Okay. And they didn't really compromise on that particularly?
No. If you're overweight, you have a physical ailment, you wouldn't pass the physical.
Did the atmosphere change over the course of the time you were a recruiter? Because you're there into the 1980s. Did it get better? Did the type of recruit change over that time?
We got more qualified, more educated people to come in.
All right.
Because with the skills they got in the Army, a person that went in during my time period wouldn't be able to do it. Because everything is technical, high tech.
Okay. Now, how did you sort of spend your time as a recruiter? What's the regular routine?
Okay, we visit the high schools. Of course, we get high school lists and we make phone calls to try to set up interviews with a potential applicant and their parents.
Mm-hmm.
And sit down and go over different programs that we had.
And what are some of the keys for success? What makes somebody a good recruiter?
Honesty. Okay, to be honest with a person. You don't tell them one thing and all together it's something different. That's why very few people that I know spent 13 years in recruiting. And my success was because I told the people where we were. I'm no better, I look at I'm no better than anybody else. And I treat people that way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, no matter what color, race you are, I treat them just like me.
Now, you stayed in one place for a long time. Was that normal for a recruiter?
No, I spent 13 years in recruiting. Normally, recruiters stay in the field 3 or 4 years, and they transfer them out. They be burnt out, and then they transfer them out.
Mm-hmm.
But I stayed in for 13 years until I decided to retire. And I've had every job in the recruiting field, from station commander, from field recruiter, station commander, company first sergeant, operations sergeant out of the headquarters, the senior guidance counselor out of the MEPS where people go take their physicals and tests to go in.
Mm-hmm.
I've had every job that they had, and I was successful in every one of them.
So then what motivated you at that point to retire?
Well, I was gun-ho. I was strictly Army. Okay, I went home, and it's just like normally when you take a leave and go home, okay, you always thinking about the troops. How the troops doing?
Mm-hmm.
Are they doing what they're supposed to do? So one year I went home to Florida, and in that time period, I didn't think about the job. And at that time, I know it was time for me to go. So I came back and put in my retirement papers.
And then what did you do after that?
Well, I retired from the Army. Well, I had 90 days terminal leave before I got discharged. And a friend of mine there went to work for Allstate Insurance Company. At that time, I didn't know what I wanted to do. So he said, why don't you go interview with Allstate? So I did. Allstate wanted to hire me at the time, but they couldn't because technically I was still in the military.
Mm-hmm.
So I retired on the 30th of July. Allstate hired me on the 5th of August.
All right. Now, did you have any college credit by then, or?
Yeah, I had 2 years. I had 2 years of college. I took 2 years of college while I was in the service.
All right. But they were hiring you largely based on kind of job experience, qualifications?
Well, we took we had to take aptitude tests,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess I passed them.
Yeah.
You know, and then they hired me, and then they sent me to school to learn insurance.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to learn the state laws for insurance.
Right.
You know, of course, you have to pass a state test in order to get your license.
Okay. And did you enjoy that kind of work?
Yes, I enjoyed it based on the fact that I like talking to people on a personal basis.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's why a lot of my clients liked me as an agent, because I was me. I wasn't someone who up there and they down here.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always treated people the same way I would like to be treated.
All right. And after leaving the military, you stayed connected with veterans organizations?
Well, well, for a long time I didn't, based on Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we came back, nobody wanted to associate with us. All the old timers, they felt that though you're gonna come in and try to change things, and we're pleased with where things are. Until a friend of mine talked me into John and the Rockville VFW post several years ago, and I've been going there since.
Mm-hmm. So when you first got back, a lot of the ones at VFW posts, they might have been World War II or Korean vets.
World War II and Korean vets.
Yeah. And so they were not entirely receptive, or at least in your acquaintance with them.
Correct.
Okay. More generally, you stay in the military, you stay in uniform, you come back from Vietnam and so forth. Did you get any kind of positive or negative response from the civilian population?
We got a bunch of negative.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I first came to Grand Rapids, people will, spit at you. Okay, and, baby killers, and, they just treat us the way we should.
Yeah.
And that's one reason why today I'm involved with the VFW. Okay, we're gonna make sure that the troops that we got coming back now is not being treated the way we were
Mm-hmm.
when we came back. And there's lots of Vietnam vets today that don't participate because of that.
Now, also, I guess, as a recruiter, did you get resistance from people, whether it was in the schools or elsewhere, who just didn't want to have recruiters come in to their campuses, or students who didn't want to see you?
Well, I think by law, they had to let us into the colleges.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
High schools, anyway.
into the high schools.
Right.
Okay, and technically, when I first came here recruiting, my recruiting area was Northern Kent County.
Mhm.
There's no blacks in Northern Kent County.
Right.
You know, and I've been in the homes where people never talked to a black before.
Right.
And when I get ready to leave, he would always say, "Sergeant Chambers, you can always come back to our house."
Mhm.
You know, the way I talked to them, the way I educated them.
And I guess a lot of the contact you had with people was ones who had expressed interest in the military in the first place. So if you're going to go to their home, these are people who signed up.
Mhm.
Yeah. So you wouldn't get some of that negative
No,
element.
well, actually, what we call a set of appointments, and I have it. Everybody that I've talked to, I didn't put in,
Mhm.
and we did have parents. They want the kids to go in.
Mhm.
You know, I'll give you this if you change your mind about going in the service. I'll buy you a new car and all that. Oh yeah, that happened.
Wow.
Yep.
All right. Let's see, are there, to kind of look back over your military career, are there particular events or incidents or things that tend to come back to you a lot that you haven't mentioned here yet? Things going to characterize the experience in one way or another?
You know, one thing about excuse me, war is lonely. You know, because you especially when you go somewhere and you don't know when you're gonna come back. You know, and with me, I believe in faith a lot. You know, faith is the reason I'm here today. That I've never been hurt. I jumped out of airplanes, I never got hurt. I went to Vietnam twice, never got a scratch. And to me, it wasn't meant for me. You know,
Mhm.
meant for that to happen to me. And growing up as a kid, from my childhood, I can't account for where I'm at today, how successful I am today. From nothing, I'm successful, and I can't account for it. But it was meant for me to do, to be what I am today.
All right. Makes for a pretty impressive career, so thanks for coming and talking to me today.
Thank you.
All right. Wherever they are, they're welcome to turn this on.
Here she is.
You did a great job.
Thank you.
You were amazing.